Most people think retirement is built with discipline alone. Work hard, save a little. Hope your company gives you a 401k. Hope the market behaves. Hope inflation does not eat too much. Hope the rules do not change halfway through your life. I have never trusted a system built on that much hope. That is the line I want you to hold in your mind while I talk to you. The retirement game in America is not really about who works hardest. It is about who gets plugged into the right machine. That is the mother line for this whole story. The machine, not because work does not matter, work matters, saving matters, discipline matters, but if the machine around your savings is expensive, closed off, and easy to lose every time you change jobs, then discipline alone is not enough. You can do everything the culture tells you to do and still discover that the system was not designed for you with the same generosity it was designed for someone else. That is why this new Trump IRA idea matters more than most people realize. On the surface, it looks like a retirement policy story. It is that. But underneath, it is also a stock market story, an inflation story, a debt story, and a transfer of power story, because once the government starts saying that retirement should not depend only on your employer and that the state itself will help push more money into market accounts, the question stops being, is this good for retirement? The better question becomes, what kind of economic machine is being built when government-backed money starts flowing more directly into financial assets? That is the real issue. Now let us start with the old machine first, the 401k. People talk about the 401k the way people talk about old institutions that still wear a good reputation long after their weaknesses became obvious. The 401k has done something important for millions of people. It created a pipeline from paychecks into investment markets. It normalized long-term ownership. It gave workers a tax shelter for retirement savings. Fine, I respect all of that. But a machine can be useful and still be flawed. And the flaws in the 401k are not small. The first flaw is access. If your job offers a 401k, you are invited into the machine. If your job does not, you are outside the gate. That one fact alone should bother you more than it probably does, because it means retirement investing in America has been built to a dangerous degree on employer permission. The worker with the stable corporate job gets a path. The gig worker, the lower income worker, the part-time worker, the job hopper, the independent contractor, the person stringing together an unstable modern work life, they are told in effect to figure it out on their own. That is not a retirement system. That is selective admission. And once you say it plainly, the unfairness becomes obvious. A person can work just as hard, maybe harder, and still miss the tax advantages, automatic contributions, and matching culture because his labor sits in the wrong category. That is why the access argument matters. The second flaw is fees. This one is quieter, which makes it more dangerous. Most people do not obsess over expense ratios because expense ratios do not feel like theft in real time. They feel tiny, 1%, 1.25%, something like that. It sounds polite, but polite percentages become brutal over decades because the fee is not charged once. It is charged against a growing pile of money year after year after year. That is where the theft happens. Not in one dramatic bite, in slow compounding leakage. Your source makes this point very well. A worker contributing consistently for 30 years can lose an astonishing amount of wealth to fees without ever once seeing a dramatic event that made him angry enough to stop it. That is how the financial industry prefers to collect quietly, respectably, in percentages too small to trigger outrage but too persistent not to reshape outcomes. A fee of 1.26% versus a fee of 0.15% does not sound life-changing to the average worker. Over a lifetime, it can be life-changing. That is the fee drain. And the fee drain matters because retirement is a long game in a short game. Leakage can be tolerated in a long game. Leakage becomes destiny. Then there is the third flaw, portability. This matters more in the modern labor market than most older policy structures are willing to admit. The 401k was born in a world more suited to employer loyalty, longer tenure, and cleaner career arcs. The modern worker lives differently. People leave jobs, get laid off, shift careers, freelance, return to salaried work, patch together multiple income streams, and move through a labor market that is much less stable than the one retirement systems were originally built around. A retirement account that becomes annoying, confusing, or psychologically sticky every time you change jobs does not fit the new economy very well. That is the portability trap. And the portability trap does something subtle but important. It makes people hesitate. It makes them leave money stranded. It makes them feel less fluid than they really are. It turns the account into a reason to tolerate a job longer than they should or to postpone transitions they might otherwise make. Anything that makes a worker feel more trapped is not a neutral design detail. It is part of the machine's control system. Now, enter the Trump IRA at first glance. People will argue about the politics. Fine, people always argue about the politics. I am much more interested in the structure. What is being offered here structurally: wider access, lower capped fees, portability not tied to one employer, tiny entry minimums, and for lower income households that qualify, a government match. That is a big shift, because what this account says in plain English is that retirement investing should no longer depend as heavily on whether your boss gave you permission to use the old machine. It says the government itself is willing to create a parallel conveyor belt into market ownership for people who have historically had less access to the existing belt. That is why this is not just an IRA story, it is an ownership story. The account is trying to move more people from pure labor dependence toward market participation. That matters. Now, I want to be careful here. A lot of people hear government match and stop thinking that is dangerous. The most expensive kind of money is free money. I agree with that sentence completely, because free money from the government is never just free money. It is a policy signal redistribution mechanism, a political tool, and a fiscal claim that will be funded by something somewhere. That is why this story gets much larger than retirement. Let us examine the mechanics. The proposal, as described in your source, creates a 50% match up to $1,000 annually for qualifying lower income workers. In plain terms, if you earn below the threshold and contribute enough, the government adds money to your account every year. People hear that and think of generosity. I think first about flow. Money is being directed into retirement accounts. Retirement accounts are being invested in market assets. Therefore, more government backflow is being directed into market assets. That is the real story. And once you think in terms of flow, the implications widen very quickly, because markets are not moral systems. They are supply and demand systems. When more money is regularly pushed into a market, that matters. Not every day, not in a straight line, not with perfect predictability, but it matters. The 401k mattered for market structure. The IRA mattered for market structure. Zero commission brokerage accounts mattered for market structure. Automatic payroll contributions mattered for market structure. Every time a new pipe is created, that channels more money into financial assets. The long-run character of the market changes. That is what serious investors pay attention to. Not because it means stocks only go up, because it means the ownership machine gains another persistent source of fuel. Now let us widen the lens. Where does the government get this match money? That is the question people do not like asking, because it makes free money feel less magical. The government has revenue, the government is spending, and the government already spends more than it takes in. That means any new recurring promise lands on top of an already stressed fiscal structure. So the money comes from one of a few places: higher taxes, more borrowing, or more borrowing indirectly supported by money creation in the system surrounding the debt. Your source makes the political case that tax hikes are not the likely first move here, especially against the backdrop of recent tax cut posture. Fine. Then borrowing matters even more. And once borrowing matters more, inflation enters the room. This is the part almost nobody wants to say clearly enough. When the government spends more money than it has and bridges the difference with debt that ultimately leans on a monetary system willing to absorb more of that debt, then the value of each dollar becomes a softer thing than people like admitting. You can print dollars. You cannot print wealth. That is still true, no matter how sophisticated the policy language becomes. This is why I say the Trump IRA is not just a retirement account story. It is a channel through which more money may end up in the stock market, while the burden of financing that promise contributes to the same inflationary and debt-driven forces that already make asset owners richer and cash savers poorer. That is the split. And once you see the split, the whole policy looks different. On one side, more low-income workers finally gain access to an ownership machine they were shut out of. That is real. On the other side, the way the system finances that inclusion may further reward existing asset holders while weakening the currency standard ordinary savers still rely on. That is also real. This is why systems thinking matters more than politics here. A worker who qualifies for the match should obviously understand how to use it if the account exists and fits situation. That is just rational behavior inside the world as it is. But a serious investor should also understand the larger consequence. The government is not merely helping workers retire, It is helping normalize a deeper reality of the modern American system. When growth is weak, wages are pressured, and inequality is politically dangerous. The easiest way to preserve the appearance of upward mobility is to push more people into ownership claims on financial assets and then support those assets with debt-fueled liquidity. That is the deeper machine. And this is why the stock market implication matters so much. When the government itself is helping increase access, lower minimums, and subsidize participation for certain households, it is effectively saying that the solution to retirement insecurity is not just higher wages, cheaper living, or a lower cost economic life. It is more participation in financial markets. That is a huge statement. It means ownership of market assets becomes even more central to survival in the American system. If you do not own, you fall behind. If you only save cash, you fall behind. If you only earn wages while prices and assets both rise faster than your ability to accumulate, you fall behind. That is the message hidden beneath the retirement policy. This is why I say a lot of people will misunderstand the Trump IRA by looking only at the account and not at the system. The account says retirement help, the system says deeper financialization of everyday American life. Now let us talk about volatility, because this matters too. More money entering markets does not make markets calmer. Often it does the opposite. Anytime you add easier access, automatic inflows, policy incentives, and more free money into a market structure, you create stronger momentum in both directions. More eager buyers on the way up, more emotional participants on the way down. Bigger swings, bigger opportunities, bigger mistakes, bigger fortunes for people who can stay rational when the crowd cannot. That is why I disagree with anyone who thinks this means a smooth path higher. It likely means more buyers over time and more violent emotional episodes along the way. And that is exactly why market crashes create so many millionaires. Crashes are not the failure of the system. They are the discount windows inside the system. If more money and more people are tied into market ownership, then crashes become more politically painful, more emotionally chaotic, and potentially even more profitable for disciplined allocators willing to buy what panic throws away. That is the opportunity side your source is pointing toward. Now let us get practical. If you believe more money will keep flowing into broad American equities through retirement channels, where do you want exposure? At the simplest level, you want exposure to where the money is going. Broad market funds, total market ownership, SP 500 ownership. Those are not glamorous answers, but they are sensible ones. If the machine itself is channeling more fuel into the broad stock market, then owning a slice of that broad stock market is one obvious way to align yourself with the flow. That does not mean every stock wins. It does not mean valuation ceases to matter. It does not mean recessions vanish. It means that over the long run, broad equity ownership continues to sit at the center of where policy, retirement design, and monetary support increasingly converge. That matters. Your source names VTI and SPY as examples. Find the deeper lesson is broader than any one ticker. Own the lane where the new policy fuel is being directed, not blindly, not without regard for price, risk, and allocation, but understand the lane. Now I want to say something even more important. The Trump IRA does not just create opportunity for people who qualify for the match. It creates pressure on people who remain outside ownership altogether. That is the harsh truth. If the state is now willing to help some lower income workers build asset claims while wages remain under inflationary strain, then the person who still sits entirely in cash, or who never bothers to learn even basic investing, or who treats the market like something only for other people, becomes even more vulnerable. That is what happens in financialized systems. The ladder may expand. But if you refuse to step on it, the ground does not stay still for you. It gets worse. That is why the real divide here is not between people who love or hate Trump, or between people who call this policy genius or reckless. The real divide is between people who understand the machine being built and people who still think the system will somehow reward them fairly without requiring them to own part of it. It will not. That is the brutal lesson of the last several decades. Asset owners keep getting pulled upward. Wage earners without meaningful asset exposure keep getting squeezed by the same inflation and cost pressures that policy keeps claiming it is trying to ease. Now let us go deeper into fees one more time, because this is one of the quietest but most important parts of the whole proposal. A hard cap around 0.15% is not just a technical feature. It is a war on silent leakage. If you force retirement accounts into lower cost structures, then more of the compounding stays with the worker instead of bleeding off to intermediaries. That sounds obvious, Good, obvious truths still matter because millions of people live for decades under fee structures they barely understand. This is one reason I take the account seriously. Even if you strip away all the politics, a retirement structure that widens access and forces lower fees is doing something fundamentally important. It is reducing the number of hidden toll booths between the worker and the compounding machine that matters enormously over 20 or 30 years. The old system let too many people think they were building wealth while their results were being quietly clipped. A fee cap changes that. But again, the price of lower visible fees may be higher in visible inflation if the matching and support are financed through an already overextended fiscal structure. This is the contradiction I keep returning to. The same policy can widen ownership and intensify debasement. That is not hypocrisy. That is how late-stage systems behave. Now let me talk about the identity flip, because your best source documents always contain one. The Trump IRA is not just trying to give low-income workers another account. It is trying to change how those workers relate to the system, from employee with no benefits to participant in market ownership, from outsider to the retirement machine, to partial insider, from someone who only earns to someone who earns and owns. That is a very powerful shift. And if it becomes culturally normal for more low-income and mobile workers to think of themselves as owners rather than pure paycheck receivers, that will have second-order effects far beyond the account itself. It changes how people vote, how they think about markets, how they think about policy, how they see inflation, and how they respond to crashes. Once a person owns assets, he experiences the economy differently. That is one of the oldest truths in capitalism now. I also want to say something many people will not like. The government helping people into market accounts is not pure generosity. It is system maintenance. A society with weak wages, rising living costs, and large retirement insecurity needs some way to preserve social peace. One way is to raise real wages dramatically and reduce structural costs. Hard. Another way is to pull more people into asset ownership and hope the rising financial system gives them enough upward feeling to reduce the political pressure. Much easier. That is why I call this a system maintenance tool. Again, this does not mean the account is bad for the worker. Usefulness to the worker and usefulness to the system can coexist. In fact, they often do. Now, what should a financially serious person do with all this? First, if the account becomes real as described and you qualify, understand the match rules cold. Income threshold, phase out, contribution required to get the full match. Do not leave free matching capital on the table if you are eligible. That is basic rational behavior. Second, understand fees in every account you already own. Your source is absolutely right about this. Most people have never done the homework. They know the ticker, they know the balance. They have no idea what percentage quietly leaks out each year. That is unacceptable. If you are paying high fees for average results, you are financing someone else's compounding. Third, own the broad market. If you believe broad market flow is getting another long-term tailwind from policy design, that does not require heroics. It requires alignment. Fourth, prepare for more volatility, not less, more access, more money, and more free. Money psychology tend to increase crowd behavior. That means bigger swings, not a permanent straight line. The person who wants to benefit from this system needs a strategy for downturns before the downturn arrives. And fifth, stop treating inflation like a side issue. If retirement policy is being supported by an already indebted system, then one hand may be handing you a match while the other hand quietly weakens the currency unit in which your wages and savings are measured. If you do not understand both sides of that process, you do not understand the machine. Now let me leave you with the cleanest truth I can. The Trump IRA is not just a new retirement account. It is a sign that America is pushing even harder toward a future where the average worker is expected to survive not just by earning money, but by being connected to financial assets that the system itself is increasingly willing to support, subsidize, and inflate. That is the real shift. And if I were reducing the whole story into one Buffett-style sentence, it would sound like this. The government is not merely giving workers another way to save for retirement. It is quietly telling you that in the modern American economy, labor alone is no longer enough, and the people who learn to own where the printed money and policy incentives are flowing will live in a very different future from the people who only keep cash and trust their paycheck. That is the message. Not because the account name sounds flashy, because the machine underneath it is telling you how the system now works. More debt, more money, more asset support, more pressure on wages, more need to own. That is not politics. That is the map. And serious people learn to Read the map before everyone else starts calling it obvious.